And we're done. Okay, the Gemara in the beginning of Yud Aleph and Aleph said like this. The last thing we talked about was we talked about the source in the Torah for chazakas. Today's daf will deal with the source that you go by saroiv, that you go by majority, and exactly the details and the cases. Minoha milsadam rabbanon. Where is the source from Chazal zil basaruba that you go by roiv? Now, the Gemara has an obvious question, which is the pasuk specifically says acher rab lahatas, which means that if you have a bezdin of 23 and 12 people say he's innocent and 11 people say guilty, he's innocent because you go basa roiv. So what are you looking for the source of roiv? It's mafursha pasuk. The Gemara says me'enal and say acher rab lahatas. It's mafursha pasuk. So the Gemara says no. We're not talking about that type of roiv. There's called ruba de issa kaman and ruba de lessa kaman. Ruba de issa kaman means that you have in front of you a majority that goes one way, a minority that goes the other, so you go by the majority. That's not what we're looking for. You see, when you have 23 members of the Sanhedrin standing in front of you and 12 say one thing, 11 say the other, of course you go basarov. If you have 10 stores that are selling kosher meat and 9 are kosher and one's treif, and you find a piece of meat in the front of them, you go basarov. That's mafurish in the pasuk. What we're talking about is going by the statistical majority of the world, meaning you have as we'll see an example, you hit your father, you chayiv misa. How do you know he's your father? There's no DNA test. Roiv, statistically, roiv times that a woman lives with someone, it's her husband. So that's a roiv. That's not that there's 10 people in front of you and 7 say this, 3 the other. This is a ruba de lessa kaman. This is a roiv based on the statistics of the entire planet. How do you know that roiv is a thing? And you'll see all the examples in the case. Basically, roiv behemoths are not treif. What does that mean? That means if you look at the whole planet, the average animal is healthy. That's a roiv that's not based on people in front of you. That's
it's not any different.
Correct, but it's not the exact cases of the Torah. You can't apply it the case of the Torah. The Torah is where you're dealing with people in front of you that are saying, majority is saying one thing, so you follow them. Who's to say that we accept the statistics of the entire planet? Who's to say? That's the Gemara Shiloh. So the Gemara says, Ruba de Isakaman Kikoitesha Chanuyos Bisanhedrin Lakimi Baile, Kikimi Baile, Ruba de Lesakaman. What's an example of Ruba de Lesakaman? Kagan Katanuktana. This is a very severe halacha that's based on a rive. You have a case of yibum, right? Yibum, by definition, is something that is normally prohibited. It's your sister-in-law. But the Torah allows it for the sake of a mitzvah. Right? If it's not a mitzvah, it's a very big aver. Let's say you have a member of the yibum, it's either the man or the woman or both, that are under bar mitzvah. They're underage. The halacha is they're able to do yibum. Let me ask you a question. What if they can't have children? What if he's a sris? Then it will be very awesome. What's the answer? But he's too young to tell anyway because he's underage anyway, so you can't tell he's going to have children. So why do we allow this? The answer is because Rive people are not Isris. So that means that we're applying the statistics of the planet of Rive to allow a union that should be Chayv Karis. So that's a Rive. Katan Uktana is a case of Rive where you're using the Rive not based on what's in front of you, just Rive of the planet. And again, we're not using like statistics, as in we're using, this concept, wherever you define it. I know Rav Asher Weiss has a whole tshuva about defining the going by statistics, Kitzer. The point is, you see this roiv is being used, and it's being matir, potentially severe isurim. So the question is, where is the source for this? So the Gemara is going to offer, 11 cases. Each one is it's pretty not so complicated. Let's go through each one. Amar Rav Elazar. The siman is vach shevach menachesh. Okay, Aisya Maresha Shal Oila. I'll tell you what the source is. Every time you bring an oila, let me just say it out so we'll see it inside. One of the halachas is that you take the oila and you cut it up into pieces. There are specific pieces. You don't mince it up. You don't take the pieces and cut those into smaller pieces. You cut them into pieces. Fine. One of the pieces that you cut is the entire head of the oila. Now let me ask you a question. How do you know? Now normally before you bring a carbon, you have to make sure it's not a treifa. So what do? You check the lungs, you check the intestines. You're not checking the head. Maybe there's a brain bleed. And so what are you going to say? Open up the head. But the halacha is you're not allowed to cut the head in half. You're not allowed to cut the head in half before you burn it. You're supposed to burn the head whole. The only way to check if there's a brain bleed is to open up the skull. And we're not. So why aren't we concerned that it's a treifa? The answer is roiv animals don't have holes in their head. That's it. So you see, that's a roiv again, because the only way to check it is to actually look. I can't open it up because the halacha dictates that you're only supposed to put it into pieces, not pieces of pieces. You're not supposed to cut the head in half. And the only way to check the head is to open it in half. And I'm not checking it. So every single time they brought a carbon, an oil specifically, because they put because the oil is the only time that you can't break the head open because you're burning it. So every single time, every single oil, why aren't you concerned about a brain bleed? The answer is because rive animals don't have brain bleeds. Well, so says the Gemara, you're supposed to cut up into pieces and burn it. You're supposed to cut into pieces, but not pieces of pieces, meaning you're not allowed to take the head and crack it in half. So that means you're burning the head whole. So why aren't you concerned that there's a brain bleed, which is a treifa? What's the answer? Because roiv behemoths don't have brain bleeds. So you see the yigobas roiv. So the Gemara says, no. Lav dafka. You're supposed to cut it open, cut the head open. Maybe roiv is not a thing. And maybe you're supposed to check for brain bleeds. How do you check for brain bleeds? You have to cut the head open. I forgot to record this one. I'm recording on the computer, right? It said record. I'm recording on the computer. Okay, fine. I'll use this recording. Because kids are, you're supposed to cut the head open. I thought you're not allowed to. The isser of cutting the head open is when you cut it entirely in half. If I cut it in half, but it's still connected, so I cut it like 70% in half, enough to look, it's technically not an isser. So maybe we don't go basarayv, and what you're supposed to do is to cut the head open 70% of the way, enough to look, enough to inspect, but you're not over the isser of cutting it into too many pieces because it's not completely cut in half. So it's lav dafka. The raya is rejected. The Gemara says, Mimai, Dilma de Polyubadically. Maybe you're supposed to open up the head and examine for brain bleeds. I thought you're not allowed to cut the head in half. The answer is it's only us if you complete the cut the head completely in two. But if it's still connected on top, less one but so it's technically not us. So maybe there is no rive and you're supposed to cut the head open and inspect it. The Gemara says, okay, another raya. I'll tell you the source. The carbon pesach, you're not allowed to break the bone. It's one of the isurim deraisa of the carbon pesach. You're not allowed to break the bone. Let me ask you a question. If I don't break the bone, if I'm forbidden from breaking the bone, how do I check for a brain bleed? How do I check for any issues that are in the marrow? Maybe there's a break in the spinal cord, and the only way to check that is to break the bone open to inspect. I can't inspect. So what's the answer? We're not chayshish for these things because roiv animals don't have breaks in the spinal cord. Rove animals don't have breaks in the brain bleed. Meaning, normally, let's say if you don't go past a roiv, maybe every carbon you're supposed to actually take the spinal cord and crack it open and check to make sure that it's intact. And maybe you're supposed to take the head and crack it open. That's why we had an oila. There's a specific issue with cutting in half. So we said, okay, that's why we mentioned oila. Maybe every single time, meaning in other words, if you don't go past a roiv, every single time you have a carbon, or every single time you eat an animal, the halal, you'll have to take the head, crack it open, look for brain bleeds, however you do this, look at the spinal cord for any, crack it open to potentially check the spinal cord to make sure it's intact. You can't do that on Carbon Pesach because there's an Issa Deraisa of cracking the bones. So how do I inspect the Carbon Pesach fully? The answer is, Roiv. Says the Gemara, there's an Issa Deraisa of cutting the bone in half. But if I can't break open the skull, because there's an Issa Deraisa breaking open the bone, how do I open up the skull to check for brain bleeds? So says the Gemara, it must be you go basaroiv, and roiv animals don't have brain bleeds. So the Gemara says no. There's a way to get the brain. There's a way to check for brain bleeds without breaking the bone. How do I get into the skull without breaking the bone? Fire. If you take a coal and put it on the bone, it'll melt the bone open, which will allow you to check. So you could check for brain bleeds, whatever. You use it to crack it open without using, and there's no Issa Deraisa of using fire to break the bone. There's an Issa Deraisa of using, cracking it in a violent way, but using fire to actually open it. Yeah, it'll burn it and it'll burn through it. Like if you take hot metal, it'll just burn it open. And there's no Issa Deraisa of burning it open. There's only an Issa Deraisa of breaking the bone, not using metal, not using heat to melt it open. So that maybe that's the way you're supposed to check. The answer, by the way, these are all like rejections. We pass can you go basarayv. So obviously you don't have to do any of these things. But the Gemara says, Mimai, Dilma demonach gumarta aleho. Maybe you're supposed to put a coal on it, the kolile, and it'll burn it open. Ubadakle, and you'll inspect it because burning it open is not a violation of the Issa Doraisa of breaking the bone of the Korban Pesach. The Tanya hamachatech begidim hasorif batzames. If you burn open the bones of the Korban Pesach, and by mishum shrias atzim, it's not Issa Doraisa. So maybe that's what you're supposed to do. Third suggestion: you bring it from the lamb's tail. Now, every single time you burn a shlomim or a chatas of a lamb, you burn the tail. Now, I would have thought that the tail is just the tail, but apparently the tailbone is connected to all the way back up to the neck bone. So when you burn the tail, you're actually burning the entire spinal cord also. So here's the point. If I'm burning the spinal cord, that means I can't be checking the spinal cord because you can't cut it open. You're supposed to burn a carbon tomim. So if I'm supposed to burn the tailbone, and the tail is not just the little flappy tail, it's the tail is basically the entire vertebrae. If you're burning the entire vertebrae on the mizbeach, you can't crack it open because it's supposed to be a carbon, it has to be tomim, it has to be complete. So if you're burning it entirely, you can't check the vertebrae for spinal cord issues. So why aren't you concerned about that? The answer is you go basarov. Says the Gemara, the lamb's tail, you have to burn the tail complete, tamima, which means not cut open. And you're burning not just the tail, you're burning the entire vertebrae. But if I can't cut it open to check, then why am I not concerned that there was a break in the spinal cord, a sever of the spinal cord? You must go basarov, and roiv animals don't have a break in the spinal cord. So says the Gemara, wait a minute. The Gemara just says, well, wait a minute. How do you know you burn the entire spinal cord? Maybe the tail is just a little bit at the end, right? Meaning maybe you're not burning the entire spinal cord. You're checking the spinal cord, and what you're burning is just the tail part, the end. The Gemara says, no, it's not true. Umas ha'etza, the pasuk describes the bone as opposite the rump. That you're burning it, it's the part that connects to the kidneys, meaning the pasuk is telling us that Chazal tell us that the tail is not just the tail part. It goes all the way up to the kidneys. In other words, it's the entire spinal cord. So back to the original point, you're burning the entire spinal cord, which means I can't crack it open because the carbon is supposed to be burnt complete. So Gemara, I'll tell you how you could do it. You cut it open to check, but you don't sever it. You don't cut it fully like we had before. It's still tamim as a carbon because it's not cut into two, but you cut it open to check. The Gemara says, "Memai dilma de pasach leu badikle b'imishum tamima hanimilat achatachat legamra v'hechatalayev." Listen, same answer we had before with the skull. Maybe you're supposed to cut the spinal cord open to check that it's complete. I thought it's a carbon which must be burnt fully and not in pieces. It's not in pieces. It's hanging open, but it's not. It's only usher to completely sever it. But if it's hanging open, kensain is allowed. Another option. This is number 4. Rav Sheshes Breder Rav Idi Omer Aisyam Egla Arufa. Okay, now an Egla Arufa is not a carbon, but as we'll see in a moment, the halacha is an Egla Arufa also has to not be a treifa. Now the pasuk says Ha'arufa ki shishleima tahava. You have to do the Egla Arufa when it's whole, meaning you can't cut it up. You have to just kill it whole. The halacha is you have to do it when it's not a treifa. How do I do this? The only way to check if it's a treifa is to cut it up. I can't cut it up. You can't do an autopsy on an egla rufa. You're supposed to just cut it whole, kill it. That's it, done. It has to have the status of a carbon, then it can't have a treifa. But I can't cut it up to inspect it. So what's the answer? The answer is you go basarov. Rive animals are not treifas. The Gemara says lichash delma treifa. How do you know that it's not a treifa? It must be you go by rive, and rive animals are not a treifa. Now, and if you want to ask, how do I know that an egla rufa is supposed to be like a carbon, that it's not allowed to be a treifa? Because it says kapara by an egla rufa, which means it has the status of kachim. It's not allowed to be a treifa, and therefore the fact that I'm not able to inspect it means because it has to be killed whole. The point is, you see from here that you can't break the bones open to check. Right, same problem with the brain and the skull. You can't break it open; it has to be complete, and it's not allowed to be a treifa because it has the status of kachim. So you see, you go basarov. Keep going. Rabbi, but I just want to point out one issue the Gemara at the very end of the daf is going to point out. All of these are not great rayas. Why? We're trying to bring a raya that you go basa roiv. And I told you, the Gemara says, what halacha? So the Gemara says the case of a katan and a katana. Can a katan do yibam? Now, technically, he may not be able to have children. So if we allow him to have bia now, he might be doing chayv kares. Because if he's not able to have children, there's no mitzvah yibam. So what's the answer? He's too young to check. If he was 25, you could say, well, he's not able to have children with his wife, whatever the simanim. He's too young. He's before the age anyway. So the Gemara says, okay, but it's a right. We allow it because right people have children. Right people are not impotent. Let me ask you a question. And we'll bring all these rayas. These are all rayas of cases where it's impossible. There's no way to avoid it. Egla rufa, there's no way to check it. Yeah, it's impossible to check it. Over here, there is a way to check it, which is wait. And if you wait, you'll be able to figure it out without going basar. Meaning we're bringing rayas of going basar in instances where there is no possibility to avoid it. I have to bring the carbon pesach. I can't break open the bone to check the spinal cord. There's no other option. And again, the Gemara offers option. But the point is, each of these cases, there is no alternative. The katan and katana, you're going basar when there is an alternative, and that's to wait. It might be annoying to wait, but waiting is an option. The Gemara at the end of the daf will point that out, that all of these cases, kemat, they're all no other alternative. And you're applying it to cases where there is no alternative. Now, the truth is, we paskin any way that you go basar roiv, so all this is academic, but conceptually, the rayas are a little bit flawed. Let's keep going. The Gemara says, Rabbi Rashila Omar Aisim Paraduma, a very similar concept from the Paraduma. The Paraduma is shechted and then burnt whole. Now, the halacha by a Paraduma, as we'll see in a moment, it has the status of a carbon. It can't be a treifa. Now, how am I supposed to know whether it's a treifa? I can't inspect it because I'm burning it whole. What's the answer? You go basarayv. It's pretty simple. So the Gemara says, Dam Rachmana v'shachar b'sarach. You shecht it and then you burn it. Mashchita kishish leima af sreifa kishish leima. Just like when you shecht it, it's a whole animal. So to when you burn it whole. You don't cut it up. So I'm burning it whole. But the halach is it's not allowed to be a treifa. But I can't inspect whether it's a treifa because I can't cut it up. So what's the answer? The answer is you go basarayv. And if you say, how do I know that it's not allowed to be a treifa? Because chatas karechman, it's called a chatas, which means it's not allowed to be a treifa. But I can't inspect whether it's a treifa because I have to burn it whole. The answer is you go basarayv. Okay, another source. Okay, this is the one that gets the goat that gets pushed off lazazel. Now I'll just say I'll say the raya outside. It's not allowed to be a treifa either. Let me ask you a question. You inspect it. How do you inspect it? It gets thrown off a cliff. Its innards are flung everywhere. There's no way to inspect it. The Gemara says that by the time it got halfway down the mountain, it was torn into shreds. So how am I supposed to inspect it? You can't inspect it. So what's the answer? The answer is you go basaref. Says the Gemara, I see Mishalech. The Rahman in the pasuk says you take two goats. One's Lashem, one Lazazel. Shushneim Shavim. The halacha is that they have to be identical, meaning they both have to not be a treifa. Go to the next page. But how do you know the Lazazel is not a treifa? You must go basarayv. And if you say, how do I know that it's not allowed to be a treifa? Maybe it is allowed to be a treifa. I'll tell you why it can't be a treifa. The whole point of the lottery is that either one could be a carbon. If one of them is a treifa, then it's not roy l'Hashem. It must be they're both eligible l'Hashem and they're both eligible to be Lazazel, which means neither is a treifa. Neither is allowed to be a treifa. I'll say that. Now, how do I inspect it? The Gemara says, and if you say, well, go check on the mountain, it's impossible. But the animal is splattered on the sides of the mountain. It's impossible to check whether it's a treifa or not. So the answer is you go basarayv. Another proof. Yeah, I know, but the point is, but it's a precedent. It's the point is it's a precedent that we're able to apply. Rav Mori Amar, another one. This is, I think, the most famous one. Every time you hit your father, you get the death penalty. How do you know who's your father? There's no DNA test. So what's the answer? Roiv bi'ilus achar abal. The majority of bias that a woman has, you could assume, meaning, in other words, it's a halachic presumption. Roiv tells us that it's the husband, it's the father. The Gemara says, Hamar achmana katlei. You get killed if you hit your father. How are we killing the guy? Maybe it's not his dad. The answer is Lamasham Darmin Zil Basarubi, go Basaroiv, Veroiv Bilas Acharabal. Most women's bias are from their husbands. So you see that's a famous Maisa with Rav Chaim. I think I told you, Rav Chaim Brisker, that when he was a kid, he was like 7 years old. They asked him, if your father and your mother offer you a cup of water, who do you give first? So halach is you give your father, because your mother's also mechubed the mother's also mechubed to honor the husband. So they said, yeah, but you only know for sure bevadois that it's the mom. The father you don't know is bevadois. It's just it's a roiv. So he said, so what would you like me to do? Give my mother a cup of water and accuse her of adultery? That's what he said. So, okay. So the Gemara says, he says, that's a kibbut. So the Gemara says, Minai, Dilma Kagoin Shehu Aviv Imay Chavushim Beis Asurim. The Gemara says, no. Maybe you don't go Basarayv. So when do you kill someone for hitting his dad? Maybe you only kill someone for hitting his dad when the mother and the father are locked up in prison together. So there's no way for her to have gotten with anybody else. Meaning, maybe we don't go Basarayv. And every case of you'll never get killed for hitting your father because it might be someone else. We don't go Basarayv. So what's the one case the Torah says you get killed for hitting your father? Is if the mother and father are locked in a prison cell his whole life, they were raised in prison, there's nobody else. So it's not Roiv, it's Bevadai. So Gemara says that's even not Bevadai. Why? The Gemara says a famous line, Afilochi ein apotropis la'arayis. You can never trust arayis, which means even in prison, people can do averes. So even in prison, it's still Roiv. Because if she wanted to live with the warden, she could live with the warden. It's still opportunities. So by definition, adultery is always on the table. So therefore, therefore you always have to go basarayv. There's no bevadayis. The Gemara says, Rav Kahana Amar, I guess he's stuck on like an island together. It's like not shaykh. The Gemara says, Rav Kahana Amar, another source, every single case of murder, Dam Rachmana Katlei, very, very good raya. Every single case of murder, you get killed for killing somebody. How do you know you killed a living person? Maybe he was a treifa. Maybe he was dying. And what, you can do autopsies? We don't do autopsies in Judaism. So there you go. The Gemara says, and if you want to do an autopsy, that's considered an avera. That's desecrating the body for no reason. The only way to ensure that you killed a healthy individual is by doing an autopsy. We don't do autopsies. So it says the Gemara, well, maybe we should do an autopsy. It's an avera. Maybe doing the avera of the autopsy is kedai to save this person, right? Because you're going to kill the guy. Maybe you should do an autopsy. So maybe we should allow an autopsy to avoid killing a potentially innocent person. The Gemara says the autopsy won't help. Why? What's the autopsy going to show? You stab the guy with a sword in his chest. So the autopsy will show that the rest of the body was healthy. But maybe there was a hole in the heart at the place where you put the sword in. You'll never be able to check that. Meaning, in other words, if you're not going to go basarayv, if you need to prove with certainty and you can't basarayv, you'll never be able to. But that's the point. You're trying to avoid, meaning say, we don't go basarayv. Right? Basarayv just says you don't have to do an autopsy. Right? People are healthy. You say, no, we don't go basarayv. You have to actually do an autopsy. Even autopsy won't help because the entire decision point you won't be able to check. The answer is you have to figure out, you have to rely on Rav. That's the point. The Gemara says, maybe the point of the incision there was a hole already. The answer is you're going to have to rely on Rav at some point. I think another source, this is the second to last one, Ravina Ma'isem Eidim Zayman. Dam Rachmana Vesisim like Kasher Zama. I'll just say that. So we'll say that. Eidim Zayman means that if two Eidim, Reuven and Shimon, lie about a murder case, they get killed. Now, how do they know? They're only Reuven and Shimon testify that Levi killed somebody. You know what the halacha is? Instead of Levi dying, they get killed because they were lying. They only get killed if Levi is healthy. If Levi is dying anyway, they're not going to get the death penalty, right? Because they weren't trying to kill a healthy person; they were trying to kill a dead man. So you're only going to get the death penalty if Levi is healthy. How do you know if Levi's healthy? To do an autopsy. The halacha is you only get Eidim Zayman if Levi's alive. If they actually killed Levi, there is no Eidim Zayman Misa. You only kill the Eidim Zayman if they tried to kill someone, not actually got him killed. So you only have Eidim Zayman if Levi's walking around. There's no way to inspect whether he's healthy or not. What's the answer? Basarayv. Says the Gemara, but Maybe Levi that they testified about was a treifa, and therefore they shouldn't be killed. You go basarayv. And if you say we do an autopsy to check Levi, the problem is Levi has to be alive. You only kill the Eidim Zayman if Levi is still walking around. There's no autopsies on living people. The Gemara says, "Vatanya, but Rabbi Yomi hargun eragin harguin eragin." Once they kill Levi, there is no misa for the Eidim Zayman. You only kill the Eidim Zayman. You only kill Eidim Zayman when they tried to kill Levi. Meaning Levi's got to be walking around. So there's obviously no way to check. The last one is Ravashi Amar Aisa Meshchita Atzma. Every case of shchita, what do you do when you shecht an animal? You check the innards, you check the lungs. You know what you can't check? The incision point. Maybe the esophagus or the trachea had a hole over there, right? Before you cut it, there was an incision point. There was a hole in the incision point. What's the answer? The answer is you got basarayv.
That's my point about the autopsy. If you kill someone, basarayv is not much.
But we're trying to avoid right. I'm saying you're right. That's the point. We're going basarayv. The Gemara says shchita atzma amrach man shchavachal. You're allowed to shecht and eat an animal, but you have to make sure it's not a treifa. Maybe at the incision point there was a hole. So all of these are proofs that could be applied to the case of Roiv that we had with the Yibum case. But the Gemara points out the rejection that I mentioned earlier. All of these rayas are no good. Why? Because all of these cases where you're going by Roiv, there's no alternative. And by the way, if you're going to say by meat, the alternatives don't eat meat, because you have to rely on Roiv at the incision point with the neck. The problem is karbanos, you have to eat. I mean, the Torah obviously endorses eating it. What's the answer? You go basa Roiv when you have to go, when there's no alternative. In the case of katan nektana, where I could just wait, maybe you don't go basa Roiv. So it's not a perfect right. The Gemara says, Am Ravashi, I'm reading the Shmait Kamei Rechana, Bamil of Kana Kamei Shid Rav Shimi, Ba'amar Lei, Dilma Hechad Efsher Efsher Hechad Lo Efsher Lo Efsher. Maybe you only go basa Roiv when it's impossible to avoid it. But when it's possible to avoid it, maybe you don't go basarayv. I'll prove it to you. We know that Rameir doesn't go basarayv. Rameir always is concerned of the minority. Rameir's sheet is always chayshel miyuta. Do you think Rameir didn't eat meat? Rameir doesn't go basarayv generally. Rameir would tell the katan nektan, you got to wait, because he's chayshel miyuta. So what that means, he doesn't eat meat because maybe the incision point is a hole. And if you say he doesn't eat meat, then he didn't eat karbanos. So says the Gemara, do you think Rameir didn't eat any meat at all because maybe there was an incision point? And if you say that Rameir was against eating meat at all, he could avoid eating, he could be a vegetarian throughout the year, but karbanos you have to eat. What's the answer? Rameir would say, I rely on Rav when there's no alternative. When there is an alternative, I'm chayshish l'miyuta. So all the rayas that we said are not really great. I will stop here.